My name is Karl Godderis. In case you wondered my accent, I am a proud citizen of Belgium, but a happy resident of Southeast Asia for the last 29 years, of which 5 years here in Malaysia. I'm actually very honored to be speaking here today because looking around the conference, compared to so many experts in sustainability, I feel to be rather a small fish. However, you heard Mark Buckley talk this morning about the $94 trillion sustainable development economy, which obviously needs to be financed. And yesterday, if you were here, you heard a panel on fintech talk about financing sustainability through fintech and also partially through commercial banking. So I'm going to be talking a bit about that, but from a different angle, from the point of view of Pragma Finance. Now, I've followed the crash course on storytelling of MK just now, so I'm also going to share a few stories with you on top of some technical information. This doesn't work. Okay. So, Pragma Finance, although formally kicked off in January 22 by a gentleman called Mike Griffiths out of the UK, this actually started the year before in India, because Mike's son was studying in India and got very sick and then was cured by a local doctor. And then Mike, out of gratitude for this doctor curing his son, offered him to build him a new hospital without having the money for it. So he went out on a journey to find investors, and through a partner of him, Yuri van Rensburg, they found a few investors willing to finance a new hospital in India. Now, following up that group of capital providers said, look, actually, we have a lot more money available, particularly for sustainability and ESG, and now that you've proven you can put together a single hospital project in India, why don't you build a business around it? And so that's how it then started off a few months later. So Mike and Yuri put together Pragma Finance, which is basically an organization focused on financing humanitarian and environmental projects, taking an angle not so much as one of carbon avoidance, as in tomorrow morning the whole world is going to drive EVs, because many of us don't believe it's going to happen so quickly. So taking a more pragmatic approach, looking at financing green technology that works more on carbon reduction initiatives and of course avoidance if possible, and at the same time building in an important element of doing good socially speaking, so the S part of ESG. Now, a bit more about the origin of the money. So I said there's a group of capital providers. Actually, this is a small club of very high net worth families who said to Pragma Finance, look, so here's a few $1 billion. Why don't you go and find us projects? Their objective is to finance green technology as a lever for reducing carbon footprints globally, as well as supporting communities with employment and also uplifting people who have less access to whatever support and needs they have. And the way basically this is done by Pragma Finance is we give 10-year loans, so we don't invest, we only lend to organizations with a minimum of $50 million up to $1 billion. And here's the kicker, they are actually soft loans. So the interest rates which are being charged are far below what typically banks are offering, and in that sense, Pragma Finance is more closer to many government financing organizations who provide soft loans like the Asian Development Bank or IFC and so forth, and much less leaning towards commercial banking. Actually, we compete more with commercial banks, if I can say so. So story number 2 comes now. Because since the beginning, Mike Griffiths has been a very long-term friend of mine, and while he was in London and I was here, we kept very closely in touch during COVID times. From the beginning, he's been chasing me to join him in this venture, which I held off for a while, if only because during COVID, I spent most of my much more available free time in writing and publishing my first 2 novels. And then coming out of COVID, I kind of realized, well, there is no money in books, so I can just do it to keep myself busy in my spare time. But then, because my background is in management consulting and an M&A advisory, I increasingly felt that my clients, the companies who either develop a strategy or do acquisitions, don't really have a purpose for the activity, so let alone how do I find my purpose in this kind of career. So I kind of say, okay, maybe I have to do something that has more purpose. If, whatever, 20 years from now, my grandchildren ask, what have you done to save the planet? Maybe I should put myself in a position where I say, well, hang on, I changed my career entirely. I started focusing on sustainability. But there is more to it. There was also, after 2.5 years, the track record of Pragma Finance. And that's my next point. Since the beginning, January 22, the organization has looked over more than 200 projects, of which close to 100 got qualified, meaning from signing term sheets all the way down to dispersing the loans, for a total value of slightly above $37 billion and an average loan value of 180 million. Now, to put that in perspective, yesterday we heard Malaysia is the largest Islamic bond market in the world, and out of that, green Islamic bonds is currently a total of 12 billion ringgit or $2.5 billion. So this is how small Pragma Finance is compared to that market. Now, so far, most of that activity was in North America, a combination of US and Canada, about 75% of the projects, 4% in South America, close to 20% and growing in Africa. And I kicked this off 3-4 months ago here in KL for the Asia Pacific region. No project signed yet, but the pipeline is filling up rapidly, and I will refer to some initiatives in a moment. In case you wondered, because it's ESG, how does that translate in terms of types of projects? So about 70% of the projects we finance have a clear environmental focus on it, whether it's energy related or waste or whatever. And the remaining 30% has a core focus on social purpose, which I also come to explain in a moment. So far also, because someone asked me just before the break, majority of the project have been discretionary initiatives, whereby a group of people develop a company and a project, seek financing, and then we finance that. For Asia, I'm now following a different strategy. I'm more talking to companies who have portfolios of initiatives for 2 reasons, because it lowers our credit risks, because they are established organizations, and also because of a minimum threshold for financing. We reach that easier by working with companies who have a continuous flow of projects rather than a single initiative. Briefly running you through a few of recent initiatives, for example, in the energy space, mainly focused either on carbon avoidance, on the EV market, or on energy efficiency. A project I will talk about more in a second. One is in Canada, which is a sustainable diesel and air jet fuel project, which was about $140 million. In the healthcare space, I'll come back in a moment to talk about an addiction recovery center in the US. And then quite a bit in the real estate sector, where several ones, like the Vocational Colleges project in Canada, the Ghanese project, Retail and Commercial Center. These are projects whereby all buildings are being refurbished in a very sustainable way, both the construction as well as the actual operation of the building. They're using as much sustainable technology as possible, but the purpose of the building is primarily focused on a social good. So either training centers for underprivileged categories of society, or creating a lot of employment for, local people, yeah. Continue, agriculture, quite a few. For example, the one in Ghana, what is ESG about salt refinery? Well, there the issue is Ghana almost for 100% depends on import of salt, which makes salt for any person in that country quite expensive. So here was an initiative to produce salt locally and therefore make the local price much more affordable for everybody. So for us, this is a very strong social dimension. Maybe a second one there is Zimbabwe, lucerne farming. What is the underlying issue? Well, Zimbabwe is a big dairy country, but it is struggling with the productivity of the dairy cows. Why? Because the price of the feedstock for the local farmer became so high, almost 70% of their total cost, that they don't feed their cows enough and the productivity is dropping. So one group of investors put together a farming initiative that grows a flour, the lucerne, which when the cows use that as feedstock increases their productivity by a significant factor. So that was the project. And maybe one more I can mention here because we spoke a lot about technology and AI. We have financed in the US a data center initiative whereby the source of power is fully based on renewable energy. In Malaysia, I'm currently engaged with a group who builds data centers dedicated for server parks that run on AI microchips, which, as you heard a lot last 2 days, consumes a lot of power. And they have developed particularly a cooling technology that massively reduces the power needs of such data centers. And because for us it is a very explicit form of carbon avoidance, we're happy at looking at financing such type of initiatives. Now, I've also asked my colleagues overseas to put together some ideas and observations about what are the key trends and challenges we see. Balancing profit with purpose. Like, for example, yesterday we heard in one of the discussions, it's profit first and sustainability afterwards. This is not how we see this world, and in a very practical way. So for us to qualify projects other than ESG, we also look at financial components. One is very important, is what we call the debt service coverage ratio. So we give 10-year loans, and we look at how much cash is generated over the period of 10 years, and how does that compare to the total loan charge, so the principal plus the interest and applicable fees. And that needs to carry a minimum of 1.25. So you need to generate at least 1.25 times the amount of cash compared to your loan. Now what we see is that some sustainability projects are about just above that, maybe make 1.3, 1.4. Why? Because they're very CapEx intense in the beginning, or their cash flow only comes in relatively late in the process. But we also have the opposite. We have projects who are so profitable that they create debt service ratios of a factor of 40. So it's a bit of a misnomer in my view that sustainability projects means you're going to struggle being profitable. There's a lot of initiatives that actually show completely the opposite. Another point in this slide I want to refer to is, since we spoke a lot about data, particularly yesterday, and reporting, data quality and availability. It's obviously important that the quality of data leads to good decision makers. So if we have projects where the project developer says we're going to create a low carbon fuel that has 50% less CO2 in it, we of course dive very deep in understanding how they measure that. But we are not biblical about data either. So, for example, now I work in Malaysia on a project that is focused on making biofuel pellets. So it's de facto a carbon neutral activity. They don't even bother yet in figuring out how they're going to calculate their carbon credits, because they say we're already in the right position with our business model. Why bother spending all our time and money on collecting data and defining carbon credits, because they don't need the carbon credits to be profitable. And another point here for us is if we come across projects where the project developers talk too much about data, that starts becoming a bit suspicious either, right? Where you say, well, what is actually the underlying business? Does it make sense or no? And don't blind us with saying we have 900 data points that we are collecting and therefore we are eligible for this or that. So that's also actually a red flag point for us. Yeah, stakeholder alignment, project interest being dropping when sustainability is not profitable enough in classical terms. As I mentioned before, we see a lot of sustainability projects who are actually more profitable. I can give another example. We work on now in Malaysia with an organization which builds and operates sustainable warehouses. They have clients like Amazon in Malaysia who says, we want to be seen globally as the most ESG compliant organization. Build us a warehouse that is as carbon neutral as possible. Find any technology you can think of, not just solar panels, but if you walk on the floors, it creates power, LED lighting that is modulating, water recycling, and we'll pay a premium for it. So again, an example of it's worthwhile focusing on this because there is a market that is willing to pay for what it costs to be sustainable. I'm going to touch, in the interest of time, the last point here, cultural and geographic differences. I was very surprised last 12 months, I can say, talking to, for example, players in Malaysia in the semiconductor industry. As you know, Malaysia is a global hub for semiconductor manufacturing. When you ask them, because often they are liable to ESG frameworks overseas, you ask them, what is your core area of focus in the ESG space? It's not pollution, it's not water recycling or whatever, it's forced labor. Right? So suddenly you see in the semiconductor industry a lot of ESG projects driven by the need to tackle forced labor within ranks. And you know, one company, they have about 1,500 foreigners working there, and they say, let's look at these people's living and working conditions, less working, more living conditions, and then they identified that none of them were holding their passports, were not getting 20% of their salaries, were living together in very poor housing conditions. So this company had already on its industrial side extra free land allocated for production expansion. So they changed tack on that. So what they did is they built a condo with shops and sporting facilities and brought all 1,500 people inside. So completely changed the paradigm on that. So I just bring this up as an example to say it's not just about environmental issues. Couple of points why we reject projects. The first point, and if you want I can explain you this in more detail offline, but we have a specific requirement in terms of a 10% deposit that we ask our borrowers to show for a period of 4 months rather than require equity in the project. We happily finance the full initiatives, but there is a deposit mechanism that I can explain outside. Obviously, management experience, not just having fancy slides, but actually knowing what you talk about is sometimes a hurdle. Business models which are more based on tax incentives and on carbon credits, but if you take those out, then start struggling to be profitable is also something that often drives to rejections, or technology that is being presented but is actually an early stage. But most important, the one that I skipped, number 2, and here we are starting to change a bit our strategy, because our view was there's millions of projects to finance. Let's start with a few very big ones, so that at least Pragma Finance as a company is sustainable. So build a base and then start looking at smaller projects. And among those bigger ones in the beginning phases, there were quite a few CapEx intensive projects which are purely environmentally focused, and I'll show one in a moment. We are changing tack on that. So if you just come with an environmental story with zero social component, the chances are really high that it's going to get rejected. No matter how many carbon footprint you're saving, there has to be a people dimension in it that is also attractive to us. Now, to wrap up, I'm going to walk you quickly through 2 projects. The first one is in Canada. It's a gas-to-liquid project that is creating alternative jet fuel, not sustainable, and I'll explain that. And the second one, as I mentioned earlier, is a drug abuse rehab facility in the US. Now, the first case, alternative jet fuel. What is the underlying issue? And also a bit of reality check. The IATA, the World Aviation Agency, kind of forecasts that by 2030, the world will require about 380 billion liters of aviation fuel, and anticipates that only 23 billion out of that will be sustainable aviation fuel. So you hear all the big airlines announce that from 2030 onwards, there will be 50%, 100% dependable on sustainable aviation fuel. Right now, nobody knows where that fuel is actually going to come from in those volumes. And why is that? Because sustainable aviation fuel at its source comes from a biomass. To meet those numbers, you need an agri space, which is in the size of small countries. So that's quite a hurdle. The capex requirements are very high because you ideally make the aviation fuel near the agri side. So therefore, for having economies of scales, you build larger refineries. Unfortunately, compared to fossil fuel-based aviation fuel, biomass provides a lower energy density, so you need more of it for the same output. And also because of the centralized industrial model, the carbon footprint of bringing the sustainable aviation fuel to the point of consumption, which is the airports where you're filling the planes, well, the carbon footprint of that is relatively sizable. So we engaged with an organization which has a gas-to-liquid technology, basically converting natural gas into not fully sustainable, but less carbon-intense aviation fuel, less as in 50% less carbon for the same energy output, and as a byproduct makes cleaner diesel and pharmaceutical-grade distilled water. And cleaner diesel meaning they intervene in the molecular structure of the diesel such that it burns much better and it contains much less pollutants. So you're not claiming to be carbon free or carbon neutral, but for the same liters of diesel, you have much more energy and therefore you consume less. And also the operations of the technology itself creates no emissions. Now, the key difference with the prior problem about the big services is that this is a small-scale modular technology. So the way to go is that you find the optimal location in terms of access to natural gas and where the airports are. So rather than be in the jungle and bring biomass into aviation fuel, you have smaller modular operations. They could be at the airports or close to it, or find a place where the gas pipeline is close enough to the airport such that the distribution becomes a lot more carbon neutral. I'm going to skip this just because sometimes the reality check is in the scalability of solutions. This is a comparison between our client and what is now the world's largest gas-to-liquid operation, which is something developed by Shell in Qatar, which is aiming to produce the equivalent of 140,000 barrels of oil equivalent, costing 19 billion. If we want to produce the same amount, it's only costing 15 billion, but the big difference is that we're talking here about hundreds of little plants being distributed versus one very large facility. Okay, I'm going to now quickly round off and run you through a completely different project. So this is a company we financed who is building a drug abuse rehab facility in the US. Now you might wonder, why do we even bother? Well, because in the US, it's a massive social problem. And the numbers here give some background to that. This company is based in North Carolina. North Carolina is one of the worst performers from a drug abuse and alcohol abuse point of view. For example, North Carolina has 700,000 Army vets. 4 out of 5 of them struggle with alcohol abuse. 1 out of 4 struggles with drug abuse problems. The project we talk about is targeting Army veterans, people out of the LGBTQ community, and also university colleges. And here's the crux. In a 25-mile radius around the hospital that is now being built, there are 44,000 people with such kind of abuse problem out of a population of 240,000. Out of those 44,000, there are 6,000 seeking immediate help and requiring hospitalization. And in that same radius right now, there's only 327 beds available. So it gives you an idea of the opportunity of scaling up these solutions. This is for us a $60 million project. And here, the prime focus is on the whole social side, obviously, of this initiative. Not just providing the services, but also in terms of employment. Also using as counselors in this hospital people who come out of these communities, either people who have recovered from drug abuse and who have followed training to become counselors, cooperation with the Veterans Association in the US, as well as with universities. So I'm going to leave it at this, but I hope that gave you a bit of a flavor as to what happens in the financing community for sustainability and ESG. And as we said, we are also on a journey. We are adjusting our strategic focus areas. For the moment, very largely focused on big projects, but particularly now in Asia, moving a little bit to smaller initiatives because of the needs for the markets. And also, we're now launching soon Pragma Foundation, where we say, look, forget about a pure commercial focus. There are projects out there who do really good. For example, the story you heard from Comet yesterday, who depend on grants or organizations helping them. So this is something we also want to get involved in, but then for us also with a clear non-profit objective. I'm going to leave it at that. I know you're waiting for lunch, but any questions, please fire them off. No? Selamat makan. There, one gentleman.
Yeah, normally for to take a finance loan, green financing, or probably a green loan or whatever, I mean, certain SPPs are required. I mean, to be met by the borrower. Hence, the financier will give their financing on loans, right? So for Pragma, I mean, normally those SPPs, do you assess them yourself? I mean, by your team, or do you refer to any second party opinion?
That's a very good question. I expected the question, actually. Well, first of all, we're not a bank, so we're not regulated as banks. So we can allocate our own money any way we want because it doesn't come from deposits, right? So we can take more risk, if you like. Now, the money is still something we want to see back at some point. So of course we classify projects on their ESG merits. We have our own team, so our head office is in London. I'm developing here Asia. We have a team that does mainly business development in the US. But the core of our credit and due diligence analysis is done by a team that actually sits in Manila. So we are quite Asia-centric in that way. And yes, we follow various protocols to evaluate the ESG profile of our potential borrowers, particularly a protocol developed by PwC in Europe, which is used. There are commonsensical areas of evaluation. Like I said before, if they come to us with too much focus on data, that's for us, well, already an alarm signal. And where it gets really technical, we hire indeed third-party expertise to say, can you re-verify for us that what is being claimed within your industry actually makes sense or is achievable or not? Does that answer your question? Okay. You're hungry, Sharmini? Okay, but then I'll leave it at this. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed all 4 sessions. And I give it back to you. Yeah.